Good evening and welcome. My name is Alice Greenwald and I'm the President and CEO of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's program and to extend a special welcome first to Andy Senchak, a member of our board of directors, but also to our museum members who are here tonight. I would like to encourage everyone to share your experiences here this evening via social media using the hashtag 911MuseumTalk. Tonight's program brings together poetry written and published shortly after 9/11 with poems commissioned by the 9/11 Memorial Museum in commemoration of the 15th anniversary of the attacks. Both then and now, poetry helps us to make sense of a world forever changed by the unthinkable events of that September morning. To start off, I'm going to introduce Alice Quinn, Executive Director of the Poetry Society of America, and poets Rosebud Benoni and Noel Quinones. Their biographies are in the printed programs you received when you entered the auditorium, but I'm just going to take a few minutes to add a little bit of background about Alice. I had the pleasure of meeting Alice Quinn through a mutual friend a few years ago. And at that time, she shared with me her own 9/11 experiences. I'm going to try to do my best to do this accurately, but you will correct me if I've gotten anything wrong. She was then the poetry editor for The New Yorker magazine and was at the magazine's offices that morning. She ran to the building roof, watched as both buildings collapsed, and then ran to 6 or 7 hospitals in the area, desperately hoping to give blood. As we all now know, with so many casualties and so relatively few wounded survivors, blood donations were tragically unnecessary. She also faced the extraordinary challenge of having to select just the right poems for the first issues that would appear after the attacks. A monumental challenge in my mind. What words could possibly contain and illuminate what we had all just witnessed in shock, disbelief, rage, and profound grief? What words could offer healing? I'm hopeful that she will share some of her insights about this tonight, and it could not be more timely. On Friday this week, the 19th, we will open a special exhibition in our South Tower Gallery downstairs called Cover Stories, Remembering the Twin Towers on the New Yorker. I hope you'll come back to see the exhibition. It promises to be just wonderful and familiar in some ways. You will remember some of these covers, and I think it will bring you back to those moments from before 9/11 through 9/11 to now. So to start us off this evening, Alice will join Cliff Channon, our Executive Vice President for Museum Programs, in conversation, after which Rosebud, Noel, and students from Stuyvesant High School will read poems written by Deborah Garrison, Vijay Seshadri, and Galway Cannell. Noel and Rosebud will also be reading, for the very first time, poems they wrote in response to the museum exhibitions here. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Alice, Noel, Rosebud, and Cliff.
Thank you very much, Alice. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see you here tonight. I just want to, by way of modest advertising for our programs, the poetry that we're going to be discussing tonight follows film, music, opera, and dance that we've done in expanding our programming to mark the 15th anniversary of 9/11. And I think to begin our conversation, it seems, and I'm hoping we're moving away from modest self-congratulation here, it seems that, with the span of 15 years and more as time passes, that the refinements, the purifications that come from artistic reflections of all kinds speak more and more eloquently about an event like 9/11. And I wonder if each of you could sort of reflect on that, what time does to our memories and to the way we think about such a major event as 9/11 was. Let me start with you, Alice.
I guess I keep going back. The drama never ceases for me of that particular moment. And Alice, everything was right except that I wasn't at the magazine. I was at home. And in the West Village, and David Remnick called and said, we could put a poem on the back page. And I read through the 40 poems that we had on the bank and was panicked, really. And Emily Moore, who was with Stuyvesant, who arranged the Stuyvesant reading of Galway Canal's poem, was actually partly at Stuyvesant and partly at the New Yorker. She was my assistant, and she was there watching this drama. And it turns out that the poem that we ran, Try to Praise the Mutilated World, was something that I had read that very morning before the towers fell. And it had gone straight out of my mind. I didn't remember it until the following morning, and then I raced back to the magazine and blew up the type. So I don't know whether because of my specific assignment in that moment, that moment still stays super enshrined for me. I can go back to it in an absolute instance. And also, partly, I had to show my identification in the West Village to get home. I mean, there was a lot of death in the air. And, you know, now we're plunged in another incredibly sore moment. So I almost feel as if this 15th anniversary is a good teacher for us in this particular moment.
Please.
Oh, no,
So, I mean, I think in order to understand kind of the 15 years and the time for me, I have to go back to you know, actually how old I was. And so in 2001, I was 8 years old. And I mean, throughout the process of creating this poem, I obviously was reflecting on that and reflecting on what it meant to experience that as an 8-year-old, where at the time, you know, I did not have the words, and so everything that was going on, I was experiencing through feelings, right, through very intense feelings that I couldn't even regulate, right. I mean, I was that 3rd grade. You know, they stopped class, they wheeled out a huge old TV that we had, and we were watching it on the news. I remember realizing that, you know, my father worked down the street from the towers, and so there was this immediate reaction. And then the week after, my mother took me.
So you were afraid for your father in the moment?
Absolutely, I didn't know
Wow.
what was happening. You know, they were pulling kids out to contact their families. I mean, you had a room full of, you know, 30, 40 small children who were all watching this on television and didn't know what was happening. And so I think about the 15 years as giving me, especially as a poet, the language to understand those intense feelings, not just in the moment, but also the year afterward, and going to Ground Zero to look at the remains with my mother and to walk through that site as a child and try to give language to that throughout throughout not just that year, but over the 15. And that was one of the toughest things for me with creating this piece, was trying to bridge the feelings with the language, to not lose the feelings in the language, because so much has already been said about 9/11 itself.
Right. Noelle and I were actually in a little bit of dialogue, right, about writing the poems. And I felt, you know, at this moment in time, like meaning now 2017, I had just come back from Jerusalem in 2001. And, you know, how many years later, 2017, around the time that I was asked to write this poem, my great uncle died in Jerusalem. And it was a personal tragedy for me that was amplified, I think, just having historical pain, having lived in Israel. So the poem I wrote for him ended up being sort of a Kaddish to not being able to say goodbye to him when he was there, because of, you know, for many reasons, but one of which, you know, I'm mixed. My mother's Mexican. She converted from Catholicism to Judaism, but that wasn't enough for my father's family. And then I married my husband, who is Chinese. So my Jewish family was like, "What are you doing?" And what my uncle said, and for some reason I had to use poetry as a way to pick up the shards, and I wrote about the green glass shards here. I'll never forget his final words to me. He said, you know, we never held you accountable for your father's mistake. And I said, well, what's that? He goes, marrying your mother. We held you accountable for doing the same thing. And those are the final words he said to me. So I'm like, what do you do with tragedy on any level when you're left with shards? How do you overcome it? Maybe you don't overcome it. Maybe you use poetry to confront it, to remember, and to take another leap into another dimension, right? Which I know I'm getting space agey. But it was a very different space for me at the time then, and it's become a whole other world now, just looking back upon it, if that makes sense.
Let me ask, in terms of the poems that you wrote, which we will hear at the end of the program this evening, what was the impact on you in terms of the event as you remembered it, or was it spending time here, or an interaction between those two phenomena? How did it shape what you wound up producing? Start with Noel first.
I mean, it was most definitely the time I spent here. I mean, I scheduled a block of time. You know, I was told it takes about 2-3 hours to go through the museum. And so I scheduled that block of time, and Danielle, I'm not sure if she's here. There she is. Danielle took me around, and I realized an hour in that I could not do it in one day. I actually ended up kind of running out that day, just because it was so overwhelming, and it actually triggered memories for me from when I was 8 years old, things I had forgotten. One of those things being actually the impetus that led to my entire poem, which was that I went down to fold white cranes with my mother a week after. And so it was most definitely kind of walking through, and again, it hits you on through every kind of sensory space, you know, hearing the speakers and reading the text and walking through it was a lot. And I came back a second time as well and spent the same amount of time here, a good another 4 hours, right? Just trying to understand and again try to see what it brought up for me. And again, circling back, you know, the feelings or these words, and again, it became kind of this cyclical act because everything I was seeing and reading and hearing then brought me back to the feelings I had when I was that age.
Yeah, I came back more than once because, you know, you literally go down into the earth. And I, at first, and, you know, Danielle also was wonderful. But at first, when I first came, I got very claustrophobic. I started having anxiety that I didn't know I had accumulated, you know, just from, not just, you know, New York and 9/11, but just, you know, I don't want to generalize Israel, but, you know, there's a lot of daily traumas there, living there. And so for me, it took more than coming back to really confront what it was I was wrestling with, and that's where the title of my poem comes from, is that you can take tragedy and turn it into something ethereal or angelic, even if your angels are, again, green shards of glass.
You know, Cliff, as is so often the case when you're in your position, we didn't really answer your question, of course. And
The questions are just a pretext. That's the secret here.
But suddenly I'm catching up to it because there is a reading here tonight of a few of the poems that ran immediately in the New Yorker. The first one we're not going to read, but I think many of us know it almost by heart, was on the back page, Try to Praise the Mutilated World. And the second one were by W.S. Merwin, addressing the words. It begins, when it happens, you are not there, but he's addressing words themselves. And then the third poem, which was in the second issue too, the Merwin was with the Vijay Seshadri. And that poem actually was on our bank, but it had a different title. It wasn't The Disappearances, it was called Flying Saucer. And the way it was a poem really about where he had been as a child during the Kennedy assassination. And it was about the tricycle. You'll hear the poem, all the wonderful details of it, and the mother saying, this is history. And because it was the moment when collectively time stopped and we all experienced something together that was a crisis, as in Dickinson's Crisis is a Hare, you know, totally dramatic and unforgettable. We all know where we were when we heard that news. And that does give you the perspective, because that poem, The Disappearances, was very assuaging, and it had that built-in perspective from the Kennedy assassination to this moment, almost a direct arrow. And maybe now this moment accomplishes another.
Well, that sets me up to refer to an essay that Robert Pinsky had written in Slate when he put together an anthology of poems the year after 9/11, sort of a way to think about 1 year's passage of time. And he has a very interesting introduction to it, but I'll only quote one sentence, which is, "More often than not, the best poems about an event are written long before it happens." And so that really does speak to the essence of, since you raised it, my original question was, which is, we're not talking so much about specifics in terms of these poems, though they're all specific, but out of the specifics, they create something that generates this common awareness, this sense of the movement of time, of the connection of humanity from one period, one event to another. And in terms of what you were thinking about at the New Yorker as you're trying to find poems that work, it strikes me that your recourse, of course, was to poems that you knew already, not, as would come later, poems that had been written specifically about 9/11, and we'll hear the Galway Canal poem, but poems that were there, that spoke to the moment, but had nothing to do in terms of their creation with 9/11.
Yeah. Well, of course, Adam Zagajewski came out of mid-20th century Poland, and a tremendous tradition of poetry of witness. So actually, there was no surprise that we landed on a poem by a Polish poet.
Right.
If we hadn't had that poem, which in fact I didn't discover until 9/12 the next morning by my coffee machine, and then raced to the magazine with it. If we hadn't had that poem, I would have probably called Czesław Miłosz, or tried to find a poem from an Israeli poet or a Romanian poet, a poet of witness. And it was just a miracle that we had that Zagajewski poem. And then when the total acute pressure was off, I was able to reread the poems that we had on the bank, and to see that the Seshadri poem really was absolutely wonderful, but it wasn't going to quite work for that first moment, but it would work for the second moment, but we couldn't have that flying saucer title.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would like to get you to read the Zagajewski poem, which we have.
Okay.
I have a copy if you don't. Do you?
I have it, yeah. And the one thing to maybe keep in mind, and Emily, maybe you'll remember this, there was only one editorial question about this poem. He was in Paris, and this was happening pretty quickly. I went to the makeup room to blow up the type, and the question was whether he was going to land on the verb extol or praise. And that conversation was so tense for me because I couldn't be too heavy-handed about it, but there was absolutely no question in my mind that we were not going to extol the mutilated world.
Yeah.
And he came around, but I had to be very gentle about it. And finally, the other day he called me and said, I was remembering, you said to me on the phone, I have a line of editors about 9 feet behind me who are all on the side of the word praise. I don't really know whether that's true or not, but it worked. So here's the poem. Try to praise the mutilated world. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of rosé wine. The nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. You watch the stylish yachts and ships. One of them had a long trip ahead of it, while salty oblivion awaited others. You've seen the refugees going nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered? Return in thought to the concert where music flared. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn, and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. Praise the mutilated world and the gray feather, a thrush lost, and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns.
It's a beautiful poem, and I think you're right that this poetry of witness is so powerful in the interaction with Polish history as well. I'm wondering, in hearing that and other poems that may come to mind, what does come to mind in thinking about poetry that may not be about 9/11, but that connects with what you're trying to express?
I mean, again, I think about the act of poetry, right? To use language, to use language that you want to resonate, to talk about things that are mutilated, right? Things that are tragic, and cause trauma, right? And have reverberated trauma throughout generations. And so what comes to mind is does that action not exist in every, at least for me, in every poem that I try to write? This idea of the act itself is trying to bring this trauma to a place where it's understandable, but also to a certain extent enjoyable. And that was something that kind of that shook me, again, going back to the process of writing this poem, was that I wanted it to also be enjoyable in terms of the ear, in terms of the words that I used, right, about this event. And I think about that in the same way that I write many poems about the history of Puerto Rico, where my family is from, and the horrible things that happened there, and yet the need that I feel to write about them in a certain way, right, in a way that is
Has beauty.
has beauty, has a certain elegance to it, and that terrifies me at the same time that it brings me joy, because it's the craft. It's a certain level of craft that I want to engage with, and so I think that's what comes to the forefront for me, is that quite often I'm trying to praise the mutilated world in the work that I'm doing, not just with this piece, but with other pieces that I've written.
Yeah, definitely. I was actually reading Nazim Hikmet. If you haven't read him, I really suggest him. And I love his poem on living. He has this great line, and I'm translating from the Turkish, but it goes, "Even though you fear death, you don't believe in it, because living weighs heavier." And those lines stuck with me, because even though, when you're writing a poem about a mass tragedy, you're dealing a lot with death. But I just kept hearing in my head, but living weighs heavier, but living weighs heavier. And I think that's like what really great poems do. As long after, the poet who wrote it is even gone, the poem will live on and become different things as time goes on, and people experience history differently.
So it really is a marker of this struggle, and we had it here in many ways. I mean, think about the display of some of the objects in the museum. I mean, you want to display them coherently.
Yeah.
You want to display them in a way that clears the path for them to be seen. But there is an aesthetic component to that kind of consideration, and it's just the tension in exhibitions that we've had, in works that we've had done. You're not trying to aestheticize anything. You're trying to make it clearer, but there are great risks in doing that, are there not?
One of the things when Alice took us around that overwhelmed me were the voices of the people in the Pennsylvania airplane. I just couldn't get them out of my head. But there was something so beautifully enshrining about keeping those voices, saying those words, putting up that fight, being so bonded, and representing something very exalted in the human spirit that really made it, as painful as it was to listen to, memorably beautiful, too. And then there's the music element to poetry as well. Because we're going to hear the Deborah Garrison poem, I should say, Deborah did write her poem in response. You'll hear that because her poem is about seeing young men who are walking through Grand Central. And she lives in Jersey. She was an editor at the New Yorker at the time. And she writes this paean to these young men who have survived the day, but whose shirts are ripped, and it's full of feeling because she has a very romantic feeling about men, and one of those gals who had a great relationship with her father, and she was just the perfect person to write that poem, and so that poem was written in the contemporary moment, just so you know.
Right, right. So let me sort of set up what is going to happen now. We're going to strike this set here and then go into the poetry reading, and you have the order of the poems in your program, and we will do a little setup between some of the poems. So just bear with us for a moment, and at the end we'll come back and say good evening to you. So bear with us as we strike the set, and we'll turn to the reading of the poems in the program.
Someone will say that Galway's was published a year later, right?
I will say it now. Let's say that when we get to the poem When the Towers Fell, Galway Kinnell's poem, which will be read by our 3 students from Stuyvesant. As you can see, it was published in the New Yorker September 16th, 2002, so that is a year later. The first 2 poems, as you see in the program, again published within a month or a little bit more of 9/11, and then the last 2 poems are the poems that have been commissioned and created for the reading this evening. So bear with us.
I'm going to read I Saw You Walking by Deborah Garrison. I saw you walking through Newark Penn Station in your shoes of white ash. At the corner of my nervous glance, your dazed passage first forced me away, tracing the crescent berth you'd give a drunk, a lurcher, nuzzling all comers with ill will in his stench, but not this one, not today. One shirt's arm sheared clean from the shoulder, the whole bare limb wet with muscle and shining dimly pink. The other full sheathed in cotton, Brooks Brothers type, the cuff yet buttoned at the wrist, a parody of careful dress, preparedness. So you had not rolled up your sleeves yet this morning when your shirt jacket, here are the pants dark gray with subtle stripe, as worn by men like you on ordinary days. And briefcase, you've none, reverse commuter, come from the pit with nothing to carry but your life, was torn from you as your life was not. Your face itself seemed to be walking, leading your body north through the age of the face, blank and ashen. Passing forth and away from me was unclear, the sandy crown of hair powdered white like your feet, but underneath not yet gray. 47, 48, the age of someone's father. And I trembled for your luck, for your broad, dusted back, half-shirted, walking away. I should have dropped to my knees to thank God you were alive, oh my God, in whom I don't believe.
So I'll be reading The Disappearances, previously titled Flying Saucer, by Vijay Seshadri. And it starts with a quote, where was it one first heard of the truth? On a day like any other day, like yesterday or centuries before, in a town with the one remembered street, shaded by the buckeye and the sycamore, the street long and true as a theorem, the day like yesterday or the day before, the street you walked down centuries before, the story the same as the others flooding in from the cardinal points, is turning to take a good look at you. Every creature, intelligent or not, has disappeared. The humans, phosphorescent. The duplicating pets, the guppies and spaniels. The Woolworth's turtle that cost 49 cents, with the soiled price tag half peeled on its shell. But, from the look of things, it only just happened. The wheel of the upside-down tricycle are spinning. The swings are empty but swinging, and the shadow is still there. And there is the object that made it, riding the proximate atmosphere, oblong and illustrious above the dispeopled bedroom community, venting the memories of those it took, their corrosive human element. This is what you have to walk through to escape, transparent but alive as coal dust. This is what you have to hack through, bamboo tough and thickly clustered. The myths are somewhere else, but here are the meanings, and you have to breathe them in until they burn your throat and peck at your brain with their intoxicated teeth. This is you as seen by them from the corner of an eye. Was that the way you were always seen? This is you when the president died. The day is brilliant and cold. This is you poking a ground wasp's nest. This is you at the doorway unobserved. This is you at the doorway while your aunts and uncles keen over the body. This is your first river, your first planetarium, your first popsicle, the cold and brilliant day in 6 color prints. But the people on the screen are black and white. Your friend's mother is saying, "Hush, children. Don't you understand history is being made?" You do, and you still do, made and made again. This is you as seen by them, and them as seen by you, and you as seen by you in 5 dimensions and 7 and 3 again, then 2, then reduced to a dimensionless point in a universe where the only constant is the speed of light. This is you at the speed of light.
When the towers fell. From our high window we saw the towers, in their bands and blocks of light, brighten against a fading sunset. Saw them at any hour glitter and live, as if the spirits inside them sat up all night, calculating profit and loss. Saw them reach up to steep their tops in the until then invisible yellow of sunrise. Grew so used to them, often we didn't see them, and now, not seeing them, we see them. The banker is talking to London. Humberto is delivering breakfast sandwiches. The trader is already working the phone. The mail sorter has started sorting the mail. Poor and rich, wise and foolish, priests and laymen, noblemen, serfs, generous and mean, short and tall and handsome and homely. The plane screamed low down, lower Fifth Avenue, lifted at the arch, someone said, shaking the dog walkers in Washington Square Park. Drove for the North Tower, struck with a heavy thud, released a bright gush of blackened fire, and vanished, leaving a hole the size and shape a cartoon plane might make. If it had passed harmlessly and were flying away now, on the far side, back into the realm of the imaginary. Some with torn clothing, some bloodied, some limping at top speed like children. In a three-legged race, some half-dragged, some intact in neat suits and dresses. They swarm in silence up the avenues, many dusted to a ghostly whiteness, with eyes rubbed red as the eyes of Zahorus, who can see the dead under the ground.
Some died while calling home to say they were okay. Some died after over an hour spent learning they would die. Some died so abruptly they may have seen death from within it. Some broke windows and leaned out, waiting for rescue. Some were asphyxiated. Some burned, their very faces caught fire. Some fell, letting gravity speed them through their long moment. Some leapt, hand in hand, the elasticity in last bits of love time, letting, could it be possible, their vertical streaks down the sky happen more lightly. At the high window where I've often stood to escape a nightmare, I meet the single, unblinking eye lighting the all-night lifting and sifting for bodies, pieces of bodies, anything that is not nothing, in search that always goes on, somewhere, now in New York and Kabul. She stands on a corner, holding up a picture of her husband. He is smiling in the smoke of today, few pass. Sorry, 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 she startles, as if she might suddenly almost see him. Suppose down the street that headlong lope, or over there, that hair, so black it's almost purple. And yet, suppose some evening I forgot the fare and transfer, yet got by that way without recall, lost, yet poised in traffic, then I might find your eyes. It could happen. Sorry, sorry, good luck, thank you. On this side, it is amnesia, or forgetting the way home. On the other, invisibleness, or never entirely returning. Hard to see clearly in the metallic mist, or through the sheet of supposed reality, cast over our world, born that no creature ever born pokes its way back through, and no love can tear. The towers burn and fall, in a distant shot, resembling smokestacks, spewing oily earth remnants. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at nightfall, we drink it at midday, at morning, we drink it at night, we drink it and drink it. This is not a comparison but a corollary, not a likeness but a common lineage. In the 20th century history of violent death, black men in the South castrated and strung up from trees, soldiers advancing through mud at 90,000 dead per mile, train upon train headed eastward, made up of boxcars shoved full to the corners with Jews and gypsies to be enslaved or gassed, state murders of 20, 30, 40 million of its own, atomic blasts wiping cities off the earth, firebombs the same, death marches, starvations, assassinations, disappearances, entire countries turned into rubble, minefields, mass graves. Seeing the towers vomit these omens that the last century dumped into this one, for us to dispose of, we know. They are our futures. That is, the black milk of our species crossing the sky. We're digging a grave in the sky. There'll be plenty of room to lie down there.
Burst jet fuel, incinerated aluminum, steel fume, crushed marble, exploded granite, pulverized drywall, mashed concrete, berserk plastic, crazed chemicals, scoria, vapor of the vaporized, draped over our island up to streets regimented into numbers and letters, breathed across the great bridges to Brooklyn and the waiting sea. Astringent, miasmic, empyreumatic, sticky. Air too foul to take in, but we take it in. Too gruesome for seekers of lost beloveds to breathe, but they breathe it and you breathe it. A photograph of a woman hangs by a string from his neck. He doesn't look up. He stares at the sidewalk of flagstone, slabs laid down in Whitman century, gutter edges, iron wheels have rasped to a metal roundedness, conscious mind envying the stones. They do not become, they are. Nothing but that, I thought, finally loathing within myself, everything that becomes. And I sat down by the waters of the Hudson, by the North Cove Yacht Harbor, and thought, how they must have suffered, those on the high floors, knowing they would burn alive and then burning alive. And I wondered, could there be mechanisms of death so mutilating to existence no one ever gets over them, not even the dead? Then before me I saw in steel letters welded into the street railing posts Whitman's words, written when America plunged into war with itself. City of the world, proud and passionate city, meddlesome, mad, extravagant city. Words of a time of illusions. And I remembered what he wrote after the war was over and Lincoln dead. I saw the debris of all the dead soldiers of the war, but I saw they were not as was thought. They themselves were full yet rest. They suffered not. The living remained and suffered. The mother suffered. And the wife and the children and the musing comrade suffered. In our mind, the glassy blocks succumbed over and over into themselves, slammed down floor by floor into themselves, blowing up as if in reverse, exploding downward and outward, billowing through the streets, engulfing the fleeing. As each tower goes down, it seems to concentrate into itself, to transform itself infinitely slowly into a black hole, infinitesimally small, mass without space, where each light, each life put down, lies down within us.
Thank you. I'm a high school administrator, so I just always love seeing students engaging with poetry. It's the best. Thank you. I was thinking of how to introduce this poem. I'm really glad that we had that conversation. And again, just trying to get back to where I was during 9/11 and the ways in which my mother kind of like walked me through that process as well. So this poem is called White Crane as Vessel. 1. My mother dabbles in the folding of grief into a perfect square, creases each line until they cascade undefined, a migration of sorrows beneath her fingers. Belly bent beneath its wings, tail toward elegance, with a blood-tipped forehead found only in America. The bird who flies with its neck outstretched, unashamed dagger through the morning, so sure of its purpose, we consider its precision an accident. 2. The towers had a natural sway of 12 inches on a windy day. Even steel knows whether you are flying or not is based on perception. As we hook our cranes to the mausoleum fence, paper becomes indistinguishable from metal. Debris, a trick of anatomy, patterns of body now useless as we search for the birds who inverted their flight. The 3 shades pointing toward their own twisted sun, rising from horizontal neck bones, something out of place. They were ending their lives without a choice. They fell as birds do, so sure of the ground we could not turn away. 3. They left dust. Choir of the past living come to blanket those who lived, cling to the lungs of their children who wheeze a solemn reminisce into the air. 3 women crowd this song into plastic bottles, containers, hands, hold light the settling of horror into memory, the making of a vessel from the mundane, proof we carry our vigils into the next day, and for years only the dust dare fold itself into a sound. 4. What my mother knew was any vessel can be an urn. Steel made a memorial, the exhale of a name made a praise. And so I breathe and dabble in the eulogy of air, thinking for something to be written is for it to be truly said, yet for something to be sung is for it to be truly remembered. I make my mouth a bird. I fly song across the Hudson.
That was really beautiful, Noel. So I wrote about shards of glass because I kept seeing stained glass, and then I started realizing why I love New York City so much is that it's made up of many things that don't really make a complete thing, if that makes sense. So this is called Poet Wrestling with Angels in the Dark, and this is a love letter to the city. And their hearts are shards of stained glass, and their eyes bottle green, and encanting the whole of this city, and the whole of the city I have seen, in the humidity, sobering, the great rose window of St. John the Divine, the unfinished of the city, the whole of the city, where one cold February in the Bronx it was snowing, and Soren and I wrote love poems for garden goers in the conservatory, among succulents and palm trees and carnivorous plants behind glass, whose green hearts dance, and supper clubs of Brighton Beach, another time the whole of city, in winter's stole and lung-gloved, the fearless girl of Bowling Green lays her weary head heavy in the chapel of Temple Emmanuel, where the stained glass speaks of a sprawling city dreamed, but never finished the whole of this city. And Dorello and I take the 2nd Avenue subway and still don't quite believe its existence, though third rail, live wire, heartbeat. And 7 train love brings me home, though signal malfunction, though delays, though local turns express midway, and doors don't always open without the whole of the city filling us all to the brim. And I have ridden my beloved 7 carrying post-heartbreak Jerusalem, where more than once I too was broken glass, shattering in a Midrahov empty on a Sabbath morning. And in these shards are the stained-glassed angels I have wrestled in the dark, wrapped around their soda-lime limbs like potter's wheel. And only in my beloved arms do each day I awaken in the whole of this city, as lasting and green, as the kind of fragment you plant and let broken be. Thank you.
Would you guys go sit? Can I ask you just to sit in the front row for me? Thank you to all of our readers. We'll bring them back up to thank them directly. But I wanted to take a couple of minutes with Alice because I wanted to understand from your point of view. You've worked with poetry, you live poetry. What does a moment like this come from? What is this that happens with the language, the emotion, the sense of common witness? And why is it poetry that evokes it in the way that it does?
Just think, what, Emily, maybe you'll help me remember this quote. It's something like, to be a poet is to experience the poetry of everything. So poets are really feeling on this register, and it's their job to register feeling on this register. And so they're kind of the vessels, they're prepared for it. It was interesting while listening to Rosebud and Noel's poems, both of which I thought were completely remarkable, and very much commemorative poems like the Galway Canal poem, that I was led to that word extol, that poets really represent the part of us that we don't want to look away. We actually want to have our feelings and feel our feelings. And we want to, in some ways, extol what we're going through, just to go back on the word that I didn't choose in that particular moment. And poets are just, they're primed for that.
And are we primed to receive this differently than if someone stood up here and just started speaking about these events or these memories? Is it a form? Is it a sense? Is it an approach to language that makes it different?
I think it's the I-thou-ness of poetry, and that a poem is really finished, even if it's read aloud, it's really finished in the inner voice of the person who's reading it. So it is a conjugal act in a way. I also think, great politicians at these moments are very necessary for us. And we listen and hang on to their words. And that's why Galway brings up the words of Whitman, which, by the way, are now engraved on the floor of the new AIDS Memorial across from the old St. Vincent. Jenny Holzer engraved the whole of Song of Myself, and you can go there and read finished sentences of Whitman's, some of which were invoked in that Galway Canal poem.
Can we talk about the Galway Canal poem a little bit?
Yeah.
Because it is, in many ways, the poem that just rose immediately to capture attention about 9/11, and it incorporates verses from other poems,
Right.
from other poets of memory.
From Paul Celan, whose
Paul Celan.
poems were sewn in his clothing, and when his body was unearthed.
A Holocaust victim. What was the life of that poem? How did it come to be? And he was an extraordinarily generous man in terms of the gift he made of that poem to all kinds of circumstances. I know this because having put an anthology together about literature, he donated or allowed us to use the poem in that context as well.
Yeah.
So this has had such an interesting life as a poem.
And I think it's one of the most famous commemorative poems of that moment. He was an endless reviser, and he revised that poem. Those were the days of fax machines, 2002. So I was at the office until midnight the night before we went to press with that, because Galway was, the pages were flying out of the fax machine. He was a constant reviser, and he worried the poem, and he felt that there was a tremendous sense of responsibility that he saw the towers from his apartment at NYU. He lived in those IMP towers. Mm-hmm. So all of that personal stuff of, waking up from the nightmare and going to the window and somehow the kind of beacon consolation of these towers to him. He lived a lot of his second married life in the shade of those buildings, and anyway, he had a very exalted sense of poetry's role in our lives, and also in Noel's poem, I was so struck, Noel, that the way Rosebud lands on fragments and the temple, very significant images. You kept coming back to birds, and the papers did look like birds when they were flying, when the towers were coming down. And when you think about it, think about the word bird and bard, right? Galway thought about that a lot. He felt that that it was very, the root of those two words was very anchored.
I'm sorry.
No, and kindred.
Several of the poems end in references to light or the universe or this metamorphosis into some other form of matter. Is that something that arose in relation to 9/11 in particular, or is that something that recurs in a variety of contexts poetically?
Well, I think you're talking about transformation and a transmigration of souls and the whole apparatus of thinking about life beyond and life other than this, which death brings us so near that conversation. Another thing I would highly recommend is the Emily Dickinson exhibit at the Morgan, where you get to see her lock of hair, which stopped my heart, and also her incredible poems about the life beyond and her handwriting, and it's really exquisite. But I think death is a great big subject for poets.
Sure. And Gullah Connell died within the last couple of years, and you've worked with so many poets over the years. This is a transition that you've seen, and I wonder what the poem stands as once the poet has gone.
Well, I was very happy to tell his wife that it was being read tonight by students. And she was really sorry she couldn't be here. She lives in Vermont. But it's being taped, so we can send her the
That's
tape. He was a big figure in New York City all of his life, and in Vermont, where he was poet laureate, and had a great bardic soul, and kind of so emblematically handsome, and you know, the corduroy jacket and all, because he was very magical in that way. And every year he would read for the Poets' House, Walk Across the Brooklyn Bridge, the Walt Whitman's Brooklyn Ferry poem. And it was just absolutely historic. Every single time he read that poem, it was historic. I don't know, I think, you know, there is something to that phrase, to rise to the occasion. And not everybody would have given themselves that task that Galway did. And he executed it anxiously, not with bravado. You know, the faxes were coming through with his handwriting and, you know, words and maps. And it was really taking some time to figure out till the very end.
You mentioned at the beginning, David Remnick calls you on 9/11, or the day, I'm not sure when the call came, but right after. And it seems very clear that the recognition in that call is the place for poetry in the magazine's response to what had happened.
Yeah, David loves poetry. As an undergraduate at Princeton, he took a year off to interview all sorts of American poets. The only one who refused was Elizabeth Bishop. Everybody else, he interviewed Galway and Phil Levine and W.S. Merwin and Muriel Rukeyser, and you know, he has a very inner dedication to poetry. He loves it.
And it came to you to make the choices that would characterize this response as part of the magazine's overall response to 9/11. And what guided you in making those choices?
Well, at first, panic. But then I got home, and it was very unusual for me to read poetry for the magazine early in the morning. And there was this folder of poems, and all of them had gone right out of my head. Of course, they would have gone out of your head, too. And then I looked, and the one on top was Try to Praise the Mutilated World, with a little check, which meant, show this to David. So I was rescued at first. And then I had time to, you know, the way you do after the funeral, you know, I had time to breathe and go and look at the 40 poems we had on the bank. And I had some detachment, and I could see, well, the disappearances could work if it wasn't called Flying Saucer. And W.S. Merwin's poem could work because he was addressing the central role of language in our dialogue with life, to the words. That worked. And then a couple of weeks down the line, C.K. Williams' fabulous poem called War, which was not about 9/11, but addressed these issues of sacrifice and cruelty and just vulnerability and helplessness. And that was great, and a 2-page poem. And you know, I didn't want the poem, we didn't want the poems to be, you know, in a conversation of innuendo with the reader, like, is this about 9/11? Is this not about 9/11? There had to be a kind of surface accessibility that said to the reader, actually, they are choosing these poems, speaking to us right now. That seemed important.
And in your thinking about this, in your work, did you find something new in poetry, or was this just an occasion for poetry to rise to the occasion, that you knew it was there, or was there some other dimension that in this crisis, in extremis, was exposed to you?
Well, I think I've loved poetry all my life, so I turn to it for this. And, you know, going back to George Herbert talking to God when he has a crisis of faith, saying, "Now I am here, what thou wouldst do with me, none of my books will show." You know, I read and sigh and wish I were a tree. For sure then some bird would trust her household to me, and I would be just. And that to me is a kind of standard for poetry, you know, this ultimate address to an ultimate inner crisis. So I think the history of poetry, you know, the more you love poetry and read it, it's just endlessly there for you in that way. And I think that right now, there's a reading next week at NYU, Monday, May 22 at 7 p.m. in Skirball. It's free. And it's 20 poems written to this moment, right now, since the election. And I am amazed by how wonderful they are. I'm amazed by it. But I really think that we are now experiencing something in this country that is comparable to the poetry of witness that was written in the 20th century, that there is that same sense of urgency and fear and stalwart, you know, consolidation of with one another, sense of crisis. And so I think it's an important moment for poetry right now, and that we're going to see a huge shift in American poetry and in the stature of it. Just the way Whitman's poetry and Dickinson's poetry does come out of the Civil War moment. We can't forget that.
Well, I mean, I couldn't resist the opportunity to get you to talking about this, but I do want to invite our readers and our poets back to the stage so we can thank them directly.
And congratulations on the
Please
poems
come up.
and
Please come
the
up.
reading. Thank you, Emily Moore. Thank you, Emily Moore.
Let me mention first our readers from Stuyvesant High School, Emily Lee, Maria Acuna, and Julia Arancio. And then, please, our poets, Noel Quinones and Rosebud Benoni. And of course, our impresario, Alice Squid.
Cliff, thank you for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.